And we are live. Welcome, everyone, to another edition of One-on-One Live at 2. The segment brought to you from R. Michelson Galleries in Northampton, Massachusetts. Please feel free to visit us on our website at rmichelson.com. That's RMICHELSON.com. Welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Ilana, and I am that friendly face that sits at that front desk when you first walk in. And today, I am joined by a very special guest, Mr. Mark Teague. Mark, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, sure. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Let's see. I saw you last at the illustration show in November, so 6 months ago. Tell me, how you been?
I'm doing okay. That's a long 6 months, though.
It's it feels like it's been years. Absolutely years.
Yeah.
How are you holding up with all this?
I'm doing fine, thanks. It's actually probably easier for me than most people because I always work alone. I always work in my studio. It hasn't disrupted my life as much as most people's, I think.
Yeah, it's a comfort. It's a comfort anyway, I find, to create and to do art in times like this anyway.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining on this broadcast. And again, welcome to everyone. If this is your first time tuning into one of these, the way it works is I have been receiving questions for Mark all week long via email. But certainly, if you were not able to send yours in, have no fear. Just write it in that little comment section and we'll do our best to get to all of them. Mark, you ready to dive on in?
I think so.
All right, here we go. So for those of you that don't know, Mark has been drawing, he has been writing his whole life. However, Mark, you chose to study history in college. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So tell me, what did you find so intriguing and interesting about studying history? And did it ever occur to you to formally study art instead?
It really didn't, which is kind of strange because I was always artistic as a kid. I was always drawing, and I was making picture books as a little kid. Just because I love books and I love to read, and I was drawing all the time. It came naturally, but for whatever reason, I never thought of that as a career. I never thought of that as something that I was going to do with my whole life. History is something I say just because I'm interested in it. It's sort of how it's kind of still how I understand the world is by studying history, and whatever's going on, I always sort of look at it through a historical lens. So it's I mean, it seems like a stretch, but it's still something that's very kind of central to me, even though it doesn't show up in my books or anything at all. It's just two different aspects of the way I am, I guess.
So do you have any sort of formal art training in your background?
I really didn't. No, I'm very self-taught.
Self-taught, that's interesting because all of your work, it has such a depth to it. You have a broad range use of color and also humor. So how exactly did you teach yourself and sort of form your style?
Yeah, the most important thing for me, the most important event that shaped this career was that after college, I moved to New York. I'm from California originally. I moved to New York. I got a job at Barnes & Noble in the city. And in those days, they had an in-house display department. So we were making the signage for the stores and also doing the Fifth Avenue windows. And that was my art training. I was working with people who were coming from the big New York art schools. They gave me a lot of advice, so it taught me a lot. So I was kind of working on the technical stuff there. And then I was also being exposed to children's books for the first time since I was a little kid, and just got inspired by the books I was seeing at that time, and started to, I think I just developed my style from there. Going home after work, working on a story, wrote a story first, then just started the illustration process, kind of trial and error, until I created a book. And then being in New York and working with with book people, that was also what helped me get published, because I'd start to know people in the field.
So you grew up in California. You went to school in California.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you choose to make that big leap on over to New York?
That was just that was like on a whim. That was just sense of adventure stuff. You know, I was just young and kind of footloose, and I just wanted to see the world and wanted to see the country. And it was all, it was, there's no plan. There's never any plan, you know, just kind of tried something, and it turned into this.
Well, that actually brings us to one of our first questions from Megan. Megan asks, you attribute the publication of your first book to great luck. While you were working at Barnes & Noble in New York, tell us, what's that full story? And do you think you would have pursued children's books if not for this stroke of luck?
I'll answer the last part first. No, I don't think I would have.
Interesting.
It wasn't part of my plans. It wasn't something I was thinking about. I think me pursuing children's books has a lot to do with the books I was seeing when I was in New York. So it was people like Chris Van Allsburg. He was doing great books at the time. Yes. There were Kevin Hawkes, Mark Buhner, a lot of people like that were publishing these beautiful books. And they were different from the books I remembered from when I was a kid, which were more like, you know, Dr. Seuss. And a lot of the books when I was a kid the illustrations were very simple, because I think the printing techniques were kind of primitive. So you typically have like a Dr. Seuss book, if you can picture in your mind, would just be a line drawing and then maybe one or two colors overlaid.
Right.
But by the time I was starting then in the 1980s, then you're just having these beautiful full colored paintings in books. And that's what really, on the illustration side, that's what really inspired me, was to see what these people, some of the people I just named, what they were able to do with the form. It was just, it was so beautiful and so inspiring that's what kind of got me going. As far as just like the whole story of how it started, I kind of gave it an outline, but it was just, I had graduated from college the year before. I really didn't know what I was doing with myself. When I came to the East Coast, I didn't really have a thought that I was going to stay here forever. It just was something to do. And but I also ended up meeting my wife in the city. We got married, moved upstate. So it's just, I mean, it's a lot of stuff that was unplanned, but it just worked out, you know.
Which is really the way life usually happens, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Just a whole series of these events. So that actually brings us to another person's questions. Your dinosaur series. How do dinosaurs ... It's a favorite for readers, young and old. Those of us who even just turned 34 keep our copies with us constantly and all the time. But for those who don't know, it is not the very first time that you have illustrated dinosaurs. In fact, one of the first books, The Trouble with the Johnsons, also featured dinosaurs. So we have a question from Kelly, which is, are these creatures a running interest for you, or was it just happenstance that sort of led you to be the illustrator of the series?
No, actually, it's a long-term interest of mine. I can remember being a little kid and having these like little plastic dinosaurs that I would play with. I also had a book, I think it was the Golden Book of Dinosaurs, and it was just beautifully illustrated book. I think the illustrations from that book are taken from the Peabody Museum in Yale, which has this great dinosaur mural. So it's like kind of this classic like 1930s Art Deco dinosaurs, just beautiful stuff. So that was an inspiration to me going way back. As you mentioned, my very first book was The Trouble with the Dinosaurs, had a dinosaur, or Trouble with Johnsons had a dinosaur theme. But it was actually a later book called The Flying Dragon Room, which was by Audrey Wood. And that just featured, the book wasn't about dinosaurs, but there was one illustration of a Tyrannosaurus Rex in the book. And it was that picture in that book that got my editor interested in using me for the Dinosaur series. When Jane Yolen wrote the manuscript, then she had me in mind because she had seen that. I had done that picture for her in an earlier book.
So that brings me to one of my personal questions. So at the gallery, we are so fortunate and we are so lucky to consider the incomparable Jane Yolen as a friend of ours. But to most people in the world, she is a giant when it comes to children's literature.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like to know what was it like for you to first get that project and to connect with her? What was that initial experience? What was that initial experience like for you?
It's kind of amazing because I mean, I had admired Jane for many years before I ever met her. I think her book Owl Moon is one of the great picture books of all time.
Yes.
And that was one that I mean, still to this day, I think it's a stunning book.
Yes.
So it was a great thrill to work on the Dinosaur projects with her.
Yeah.
I think people don't always understand like the collaboration between an author and an illustrator on a picture book tends to be very distant. So I actually didn't meet Jane until after the first book was published, and we met, I think, at a book signing the very first time.
Interesting.
So the whole collaboration takes place without the author and the illustrator really working together at all. It's mostly the editor of the project kind of is the director of the whole thing, and both of us work separately through the editor. So after Jane and I published the first book, then we got to know each other. We're good friends now, but just to be clear, we didn't really have a collaboration on the project to begin with.
Interesting. So it's, we do have another question from Drew. He is wondering, like in the books with Jane, you often choose to work with acrylics as opposed to oils. And he is wondering, why is that your medium of choice? Oils can be a little bit, I think, easier. You have a little more freedom with them. Is there a reason you choose to continue working with acrylics?
I've worked with both. Sometimes I work with oils, but I use there's a water soluble oil paint that you can get now, which because normally the thing with oils, of course, is you need a paint thinner to clean them, or use turpentine. Those chemicals in oil paints are really toxic.
Yeah.
And if you're working inside your house, like I've always just had a studio inside my house, there's always a little leery also with the kids to just be putting that sort of toxic stuff into the room. So acrylic paints are more forgiving that way. The water soluble oils are less toxic, but there's still some of that problem. The other thing that's an advantage with acrylic paints is that they dry quicker. So it's easier to work quickly with the paint. You don't have to wait for the drying time. Those are some of the problems with oils. I love oil paints. I love the depth of the paints. I think if I was doing more fine art, I would work with oils rather than acrylics. But for the illustration, acrylics I think are a little easier.
We have a question also now, again, pertaining to the dinosaurs and the series. I believe this is from our youngest viewer, Michael, who I think asked a question a couple weeks ago. And Michael is wondering, what is your favorite dinosaur to paint?
Oh, man.
And hi, Michael. Thank you again for your questions.
That's a great question. My favorite dinosaur when I was a kid, and still maybe my favorite, is the Tyrannosaurus Rex. That was just always the coolest dinosaur. And that's the one, yeah, so yeah, got the cover spot on the very first book.
Yeah.
One of the things that's cool about the whole series is that every book has different dinosaurs in it. So it's part of what keeps the series fresh and what keeps it interesting to me, because I love dinosaurs. I like studying dinosaurs. And one of the first things I get to do whenever there's a new book to work on is I get to go back and study a whole new set of dinosaurs and get practice drawing them. So actually, I have lots of favorites, lots of different dinosaurs. They tend to kind of come in a few different groups. So there's like the long neck dinosaurs, which are, you probably know, like the Brontosaurus was the famous one when I was a kid. The Tyrannosaurus Rex, there's also a lot of other dinosaurs in that category. There's the ones that are like the Triceratops, the ones with the horns. So it's kind of fun because they come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. And if you're an illustrator, it's kind of like a playground. I mean, there's just so much stuff to play with.
And for those of you who don't know, or you're not familiar with the series somehow, I advise you to pick them up, because not only does Mark do an extraordinary job illustrating them, and you can see all of the illustrations at rmichelson.com, but more than that, it's also a learning tool, because Mark is smart enough to put the name of the dinosaur in the picture so that you can really easily identify them, and frankly, learn your dinosaurs if you don't know them. Which will bring us to one of our first live questions, Mark. Deb is wondering, did you study any sort of zoology?
I never did. No. Most of what I learned now, it's actually gotten easier. When I was first doing this series, and even longer ago when I was first starting off illustration, trying to find reference material would mean going to a library, or I always had a big collection of National Geographic magazines. Those were good to look at. Now it's super easy because you can just Google whatever you want to find and go online. And actually, one of the problems now is that it can be kind of a rabbit hole. You just go down and you're finding more and more stuff. But I think I've learned a fair amount of dinosaurs just in that process, just book to book. Stuff that actually doesn't even show up in the book. I just get interested and start reading more and more about the animals.
Well, let's see. Let's move on. So Lisa is wondering, you've said before in other interviews that you enjoy painting because it's like playtime for you, as opposed to when you are writing, because for those who don't know, Mark is also an extraordinary author. When you're writing, you've said you really need to focus. Lisa is wondering if you could talk a little bit about the difference in those two, the process of illustrating versus the process of writing. Do you throw some music on when you're illustrating as opposed to really need to hone in and focus when you write, or what are the two like for you?
That was a pretty good summary. I mean, that is the truth. I mean, usually if I'm doing both the writing and the illustrating on a project, typically the writing comes first, and that's a very intense sort of process where I really do I have to have a quiet room. I give myself space and time, and just a lot of times the writing process will start with just things like I'll start writing lists, or just free writing, whatever pops into my mind. Lists are a good way to do it. Instead of trying to write complete sentences or paragraphs, just whatever comes to mind. And it's just sort of, I think it's a way of just kind of pulling the subconscious out, just letting your subconscious process start to come out onto the paper. And sometimes while I'm doing that, I'll also be sketching, because sketching comes naturally to me, but it's just a way of getting the ideas out. And so that whole process requires a lot of concentration, and I do that in a quiet room by myself. Later on during the illustration process, it's true, it's more like play, and I can be holding a conversation with someone, listening to music, listening to a podcast, whatever.
What do you listen to? Tell us.
Much freer that way.
What do you listen to?
What do I listen to?
What do you listen to?
All kinds of stuff. I don't know. I've wide-ranging taste in music, and a lot of times now it's just podcasts, news stuff, just a whole range of stuff. That's nice too. Actually, that's another thing that's so much easier now than when I was first starting out, and it was just whatever dumb stuff was on the radio. I mean, things have gotten much easier in my job in some ways.
They have. The tech has really opened up a world of entertainment, including this. This would not have been possible years ago. So I actually want to talk a little bit about one of my new favorite books of yours, in which you are responsible not only for the illustrations, but the story as well. For those who have not yet picked up a copy of Fly, I highly recommend doing that. Those are also illustrations that you can see on ourmichelson.com. What is so interesting to me, Mark, about that book, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. And with your pictures, you are somehow able to convey this incredible humor. For those who don't know, Fly is a book about a mother bird who is essentially trying to coax out her baby bird and teach the bird how to fly. And what was interesting to me is that you chose, instead of presenting the story with words, it's all in word bubbles, you actually use imagery inside of the word bubbles. And what I think is interesting is somehow the story is still very clear. Was there any difficulty in terms of trying to figure out how to have those birds reveal their communication through? Did you have any roadblocks with that process?
Yeah, that is my first, so far my only wordless picture book. Mm-hmm. And I didn't intend it that way. I started off trying, as just the process I was just talking about, I started off trying to write a story. I had an idea about the young bird leaving the nest. I was trying to write it. The writing wasn't going well. I started to draw it instead. I really liked the character of the little bird, and I just kept drawing that character over and over again, trying to see what would happen. At some point, the mother bird shows up, and I started drawing her over and over again, and then the two of them interacting. And so the story was coming out much more fluidly through the pictures than it was through the writing. And every time I tried to write it, the story would get too involved and too complex. And I felt like I was stepping on the humor. It wasn't as funny. It wasn't as engaging. And eventually the words just went away. And I just felt like I could tell the whole story in the pictures. At some point, I got my editor, Alan Johnson at Simon & Schuster. She got involved in the process. I showed her the pictures. It was really invaluable to have her point of view, because especially when it's just pictures, you don't always know, as the illustrator, you don't know exactly what you're communicating. So much is sort of in your own head. And so to have her point of view, she could question anything that wasn't quite clear in the pictures, and then I could go back and redraw it. Ended up drawing the whole story 4 or 5 times straight through to get to the point where everything was clear enough. Also, you have to think also you're trying to communicate with maybe a 4 or 5-year-old as well. So you're trying to make sure that everything is very clear. There's also conventions about how you would read from left to right. Mm-hmm. The same and top to bottom. So the same thing has to follow with the illustration. So it's sort of a reading process even without the words. So how the pictures sequence, the way they flow, all of that stuff is very important for the communication. It was kind of a puzzle, actually, making the whole thing to make sure that a child could pick up the book and go through those pictures and see the whole story and understand the story straight through. That was a challenge, and it was fun. But it was sort of a unique challenge. It's different from any other book I've worked on.
One of the things that I found most interesting about the choices that you made, and to touch on what you just said, again, if you have the book, and if you don't, go pick it up. It's fabulous. But one of the choices you made, Mark, was that on some of the illustrations, the reader actually has to flip the book vertically to see the full, the spread. And if you don't have the book and you want an idea of what I'm referring to, go to rmichelson.com, because we have some of those images up there, and you'll see what I mean by the vertical as opposed to that horizontal. Was that always an intention that you had, to sort of make it a little more interactive for the viewer, because they actually have to turn the book themselves, they become an active participant in the reading? Or was it a problem solving issue? Why did you make that choice?
I got to credit my editor. That was Ellen Johnson. It was her idea, and it was a problem. It was problem solving, but it was also super brilliant. Like you could see how it works. So much of a one of the things that's really great about picture books is it really is a physical medium. Like it works on turning pages. Like what happens when you turn a page changes the story. That's why picture books work as traditional books better than as any sort of electronic thing, because it's a very physical thing. And little kids, they learn a lot just with their hands in using a picture book. So having these spreads where you actually turn the book is it's just another feature of the book that's really cool.
It was
but it
genius.
was definitely solving a problem, because those illustrations are tall vertical illustrations, and the orientation of the book is basically horizontal, and it has to do with the bird falling out of the tree. There's just no really good way to show that without making that turn. But I have to credit my editor. It was her idea.
I found it to be a genius way to problem solve and way to continue telling that story so seamlessly. And what I really loved about it was that the reader became an active part of the story.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
I thought that was absolutely fabulous.
Exactly.
We have another question from Joyce. She is wondering, Mark, did you have any favorite books when you were younger, or any particular artists, which I know you've sort of already touched on, like Chris Van Allsburg, any particular artist that as a child you were inspired by?
I always tell people that, because it's totally true. My very favorite book when I was a little kid was Where the Wild Things Are, which is the Maurice Sendak book. But I was so obsessed with that. That particular book belonged to my brother's best friend. They're about 3 years older than me, and so I was a little annoying little brother who just tagged along. And our friend Tommy figured out like the best way to get rid of me was just hand me Where the Wild Things Are, because then I would just sit down and pour over the book. They could go do whatever they wanted to. So it wasn't even my book. It was Tommy Schwerner's book. I would be at his house and I would read Where the Wild Things Are. Anytime I was down there, I'd read Where the Wild Things Are. And I'm just absolutely obsessed with that book. But I was kind of a bookish kid anyway, and my mom would take my brother and I to the library. She'd love to read, so she would go to the library every week, and we would come along, and I would come home with a big stack of picture books. So it was Maurice Sendak, Dr. Seuss. I love the Babar books. Arnold LaBelle's books, just all the classics from that era. I read them all. I mean, it's really, looking at it now, it seems kind of obvious that I was going to be a children's book illustrator, but I didn't know it at the time, but I was clearly obsessed with picture books as a little kid.
You mentioned a lot of the classics, and what has been interesting, I will say, we've been getting a lot of very similar questions every week, and every single illustrator that has joined me has, for the most part, touched on Sendak in particular, and what an inspiration he was to this next generation of illustrators. I just want to let everyone know that we are at our 2:30 mark, so we are starting to wind down. So please, if you have any other questions and you want to get them in, do just make sure to get them into the comments, and I'll try to get them in without keeping Mark too long. Mark, Julie is wondering, Are you currently working on any projects that you can talk about?
Yeah, you can probably see some of it in the background on the wall up there. It's sort of I'm doing this picture book, and it's kind of on the King Kong theme. I won't give away the whole story, but that's why it's black and white, because it's kind of mimicking the old movie. And it's basically about King Kong has a cousin who's just a regular little guy, and he's kind of he wants to be kind of big and strong like his hero, and he's just not. So it's just it's basically following the cousin around New York. They both just live in New York. But I'm having a lot of fun with that. There was something I grew up with, was that movie was another thing that goes way back to me in childhood, and I always loved that. I had a big King Kong poster in my bedroom as a kid. So this is just something it feels kind of like in my wheelhouse. It's something that it's just a lot of fun to me. It kind of reconnects me with stuff that I loved when I was a little kid.
So are those illustrations that we'll be getting at the gallery eventually?
No doubt.
That I get to see?
Yeah,
and hold?
eventually.
My absolute favorite. So what I'm going to do, Mark, is I'm going to wind down by asking you, as we are currently sitting here dealing with all this stuff going on in the world, what would you tell all of your readers, both young and old? Do you have any piece of advice for staying positive or uplifted, or just day-to-day dealing with all of this confusion? I know that's a loaded question.
Yeah, that's a big question. I don't know that I have any particular insight that other people don't have. I think I do feel lucky because my work's always been a little bit solitary, and I've always had this, to me, there's always solace in doing the artwork and doing creative things. And I would recommend to anyone who does have that impulse, not just for drawing, whatever your creative impulse is, this is a really good time to go into those sorts of things. Instead of feeling sort of bereft of your social life, which we all are, it's maybe sort of a good time to connect with the stuff that you can do by yourself in the home. And I think, for me, that's naturally illustration and writing, but I have friends who are taking time to do songwriting, to make cabinets, to work on things. I have a friend who's building a guitar. It's just a good time to be doing stuff like that. And I guess maybe the other thing is if you're just spending a lot of time with news. I have a problem with that, spending a lot of time with the news of the day, and there's just a lot of gloom in there, and it's I think it's worthwhile to pay attention, to know what's going on, but it's also probably a good habit to separate from stuff like that. There's I think it's probably not helpful to dwell too much on stuff that you can't really affect or change, and these are big global things that we can't affect or change very much, and it's better to spend time with things that you can do. And if you're going to get more involved with this the issues of the pandemic, there's probably people around you in your life that you can help directly, and do that instead of getting involved too much in the politics of the thing.
It's a good time to focus, I think, on connection, which is why we're so grateful that not only you took the time to be with us, but thank you for letting us into your studio, for giving us a little peek sneak at a new project, and really thank you just for your contribution to the world of children's literature, because I have to tell you, it gets people through. It really does. It not only unites us and not only connects us, but it gives us such an uplifting escape. And I can say that, at least for myself, and I'm certain I speak for millions of other people as well. So thank you so much, Mark, for joining us and taking the time to do this. And Again, if you want to see any of Mark's artwork, it's all on there, rmichelson.com, which is RMICHELSON. Mark, I'm going to hope to see you in November.
Absolutely. Thanks very much. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. The pleasure was entirely ours. Mark, stay well, and thank you again. And thank all of you for joining us. And we'll see you next week, where we will be talking with Mr. Matthew Cordell. So we'll see you then. Thanks so much, Mark.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.